Dehumanization is racism on steroids, right? They're not lesser humans, they're less than human. So I want to get rid of race.
Hello, David.
Hello.
Welcome to How the Light Gets In.
Thank you, I love it here.
So you've built your career and your scholarship on quite a dark topic.
I have indeed.
Dehumanization.
Yeah.
What led you to focus on this?
There are two sides to the answer to that question. One is autobiographical. I grew up in the deep south of the United States in the 50s and 60s. I'm obviously not a youngster. And this was the days of segregation and really the horror of the oppression of African Americans was palpable. And I grew up there, but my family moved down from New York City, so I wasn't socialized into Southern culture. And a child in that circumstances cannot help but recognize there's something very wrong here. At the same time, I grew up in an extended family with my maternal grandparents, and their families came to the United States from Eastern Europe early in the 20th century. They were Jewish refugees. And my grandmother in particular, who was a self-educated woman, she had to leave school at the age of 14 to help support the family. But she had a deep interest in many things, including the history of racial oppression, anti-Semitism, the genocide of Native Americans, and so on. And she kind of helped me navigate that world, gave me some understanding. That's the autobiographical side. On the non-autobiographical side, around about 2005, I was working on a book, not one of my best, I can say in retrospect, on war. And I came across all of this wartime propaganda representing enemies as dangerous subhuman creatures or as game animals to be hunted for sport. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. I need to read more. And I found that the literature was actually extraordinarily limited. Most of it, in fact, virtually all of it, was in social psychology. And I had real issues with the way social psychologists were handling this. I'm a philosopher, so I approach things differently. Having dinner with a friend, I was talking about this very subject, and he said, David, this has got to be your next book. Everyone will have to cite you, because there was no single authored book. In fact, there was no book in the English language at the time focusing on this phenomenon.
Wow. And would you give us a quick definition of it?
Yeah, it's a very important question because the word dehumanization has come to mean so many different things and often casts more heat than light when we're discussing a topic. So it's not that there's a right meaning and a wrong meaning, it's just there are a multitude of meanings. So it's very important to specify what one means. And what I mean is that dehumanization is the attitude of thinking of others as less than human creatures. And every word of that is chosen very carefully. So it's not the same as racism or sexism or these multitude of other nasty isms. It's very, in the way I handle the concept, very particular.
And what makes it so particular? Why isn't it racism, for example?
Well, some people treat racism as dehumanization or sexism as dehumanization, but I'm a big fan of making distinctions. So let's consider a prior question. What's the point of studying these things in the first place? Well, presumably to intervene. We want to get rid of them. We want to do something about them. And to do something about something, it really helps to understand how it works. To pop the bonnet and look inside. And all of these prejudicial attitudes, these derogatory attitudes, have certain similarities, but they have different dynamics. And so I think it's very important to distinguish them, to theorize them independently of one another, simply for the purposes of intervening in some sort of way. And even if we don't know how to intervene, that sort of knowledge will be essential, I think, for for intervening.
Do you think that dehumanization is intrinsic to the human psyche or to being human?
I'm not sure what you mean by intrinsic. So I'm a philosopher, so I can go on about that. Dehumanization is a complicated phenomenon because it involves psychological dispositions as well as social and political forces. So you need to straddle two domains to understand dehumanization. And this, by the way, is my problem with the social psychologists. They concentrate what's in people's heads and pay lip service to social and political realities. So obviously we are capable of dehumanization. Well, let's go a little bit deeper. To be capable of dehumanization means that we have certain psychological dispositions that, in my view, are responsive to dehumanizing propaganda and ideology. So insofar as these dispositions are a feature of human beings generally, I guess we could say, yeah, it's intrinsic. But dehumanization has to be, it comes from the outside. It doesn't come from the inside. People don't wake up one morning and say, oh yeah, those people over there, they look a little bit strange, they must be subhuman. That's not how it works. If you look at actual historical examples, people need to be inculcated with dehumanizing attitudes.
So are you saying that dehumanization is almost a means for an end?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. At least very, very often. So what actually happens is that people in positions of epistemic authority, that is, people who are supposed to know, and this could be on a grand scale. It could be the minister of propaganda, like Joseph Goebbels. It could be a radio host, a celebrity, a scientist, whatever. They're all people that we may accord that status of authority, of epistemic authority. Or it may be your parents or people, your teachers, or in the local community, so it can be more distributed. But they're supposed to know, and they tell us in one way or another, don't trust what your eyes tell you. These others merely look human. They're not really human. They're not human on the inside where it matters. And there's an interesting kind of paradox involved in this. So human culture relies on this distinction of cognitive labor between the expert and the non-expert. That's how we get cumulative knowledge over time. And it is rational, it's entirely rational to accept what the experts tell us, right? So the physicist tells me this table in front of me is mostly empty space. Well, doesn't look like that to me. But I defer. I said, well, my eyes deceive me here. Well, what if the expert is telling you that people of African descent are subhuman, as has often been the case, that experts have said that, or that Jews are Untermenschen, subhumans? Well, it's just as rational, I'm afraid, if we consider these people experts to defer to their points of view. Now, typically, people who tell us this have an agenda. They need to get us to overcome our inhibitions against doing harm to other human beings. Inhibitions? Yes. We are ultra-social animals, and as ultra-social animals, we have to have powerful inhibitions against doing particularly lethal harm to members of our own kind, because one can't maintain a social existence if people are ripping each other's throats out, right? So all social animals have these inhibitory mechanisms. We do too. But clever primates that we are, we've developed ways of disabling them, and dehumanization is one. It's not the only one, but it's one way of disabling inhibitions against terrible forms of violence.
So does the intervention you were speaking of have to do with expertise, or how would you suggest intervening against dehumanization?
Oh, this is very complicated. first of all, there's no vaccine, right? And we are all potential victims of dehumanization, at least in principle, and certainly potential perpetrators of dehumanization. I mean, we like to think these people, Hitler and Himmler and so on, they're monsters. Well, there aren't any monsters. To say that they're monsters is precisely the wrong attitude, and in fact, it's an attempt to dehumanize the dehumanizers, right? It's the wrong attitude because it's a way of saying, oh, I'm nothing like that. Whereas in fact, we should be looking at the mirror that they hold up to our potential for inflicting harm on others. I can rattle off a list here. Certain forms of education, I think, are important. One form of education that's important is genuine historical education rather than the, pardon the expression, bullshit that is normally fed to students that glorify their own nation. I mean, everyone in the world, every group in the world has blood on their hands at some point in history, and it's very, very important to recognize this because that induces a sense of humility. Oh my God, we are capable of inflicting these harms on others, whoever we are. Proper education, a certain sort of psychological education. So we need to be able to be vigilant because we're all responsive to these kinds of propaganda under the right circumstances. So we need to understand the specific psychological propensities that make us vulnerable to that. In addition, and this is one of my more controversial views, the worst forms of dehumanization, the forms of dehumanization that lead to genocidal violence, say, are rest on the foundation of racialization. Race, the notion of race and the practice of racializing others is the prelude to dehumanizing them. So when people are racialized, they're seen as lesser humans. Dehumanization is racism on steroids, right? They're not lesser humans, they're less than human. So I want to get rid of race. I think it's a toxic, evil, white supremacist invention, at least race as we know it in Europe and the United States. And that's, I don't have great hope that will catch on, but I think that would be very powerful intervention. The last on what could be a much longer list is providing citizens with basic security. And the reason for that is propagandists who want to manipulate us into doing terrible things to others do that by making us insecure, making us feel helpless and vulnerable. And then offering these magical solutions to us. And dehumanization comes in, there's a really good sort of taxonomy of the stages of this. And dehumanization often comes in the middle, where we say, it's these others, these evil, destructive, and then some racial category is invoked that are destroying, they're responsible for all of our problems. They look human, but they're not human. They're monsters, they're demonic, they're beasts. And so often not that explicit, right? Because that sort of language, certainly in the United States and Great Britain, expressed directly is no longer socially acceptable. So one talks about swarms of immigrants, breeding grounds for terrorism and things like that. And the listeners, of course, connect the dots. Swarms, breeding grounds, these are animalistic images.
Philosophers like Emmanuel Levinas would say that the face-to-face human connection can overcome many prejudices.
Well, I'll say right away that Levinas is totally unintelligible to me. I'm an analytical philosopher. Face-to-face is important, but it's important perhaps in a slightly paradoxical way. I think that the sight of a human face, we cannot help but see human when confronted with that, particularly eyes, a pair of human eyes. And we know the brains process faces in a very different way from any other visual information. So we can't help but see human. But At the same time, we may have drunk the Kool-Aid that these others that we are seeing face to face are really animals. They're not humans at all on the inside. Now that sets up actually something which produces the most toxic effects of dehumanization, which is seeing others as simultaneously human, wholly human. That's this almost instinctive response to the sight of the human face, while at the same time conceiving of them as subhuman. And the superimposition of these two representations turns them into monsters. So if we look at what's called monster theory in academia, monsters are impossible combinations. Monsters of, say, horror fiction are impossible combinations of mutually exclusive kinds of things. So think of a werewolf that's a wolf and human simultaneously, or a zombie that's alive and dead simultaneously. Well, human, subhuman, superimposed transforms the other into monsters. And then they are, let's put it this way. If you're fighting monsters, nothing's off limits, right? Nothing is off limits. So oddly enough, it's this combination of seeing human while deferring to those who say the other is not human at all, which really ramps up dehumanization. So on your characterization of Levinas's position, no, I don't, sadly, I don't think that's sufficient.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I did want to go back to the race question because I
Yeah.
know you and your wife, Subrena, have written about that recently.
Yeah.
So the counter-argument to abolishing race as a category would be that people are still living through the economic, political, social implications of it.
But we can deny that race is a reality without denying that people are racialized, that people are oppressed because of the belief that they are lesser human beings, right? All of that still stands. In fact, I think it's very important. Race, if we're right, that race was inflicted on people who have been historically subordinated in order to oppress them, then it's part of the problem. It's an assault on their humanity. And I think it's really vital to reject it. Just as, to use an example which entered the literature, not used in exactly this way, around 1980, we don't have to believe in witches to recognize that the victims of the witch persecutions were horrifically treated. And you can imagine the descendants of those who were persecuted, perhaps here in the town of Y, tortured and murdered by the mob, being told that there's no justice for them unless they accept that their ancestors were witches. And then by descent, they are witches. Well, that's nonsense. We need to do the absolute opposite, right? We need to throw off that white supremacist or anti-Semitic or whatever, the saying is, imposition. And I think that's crucial for doing justice to people who have been harmed and oppressed and continue to be harmed and oppressed.
Why do you think people on both sides are so attached to the concept of race still?
Well, I can speak with most knowledge about the United States. In the United States, race saturates everything. It's everywhere. Everyone is marinated in that. And in consequence, it's built into people's identities usually very, very early. Before they can even think about it. They grow up raced. And of course, racialization secures certain privileges for many of those in the dominant group, right? So there are incentives, taken for granted incentives in keeping this concept intact. I think it's very difficult if you've grown up in a highly racial society to divest oneself of race. Rather, the impulse is to try and clean it up to cleanse it of its terrible history and its terrible connotations. But to my mind, that's like trying to clean up the swastika. Imagine that. Imagine contemporary Germany, say the AfD gets in Germany, and we're going to reinstate the swastika. Nowadays has nothing to do with the Holocaust. It's a symbol of German pride. In the United States, that's how some people treat the Confederate flag. That wouldn't be credible. Well, race is worse than the swastika, right? The swastika was an emblem of one manifestation of the horrors inflicted through the notion of race, but it's only one. How about the 12 million killed in the Congo by the Belgians? How about, I mean, we can go on and on and on historically. So that's my take on that.
You have said in an article on this topic that we need, I think, explicit and critical education about race.
Absolutely.
What does that mean, do you think?
Well, let me give you an example. I teach college students, and one of my courses is called Race, Racism, and Beyond. They come into this course without a clue about the history of race, the scientific status of race, and it's really eye-opening for them. And one of the responses I get most by the end of the semester is, I'm so angry I wasn't taught the truth. I mean, they're just not taught. And I would imagine in the UK, I used to live here, the truth about the horrors inflicted by the British Empire, say the famines in India, for instance, are not routinely taught in their graphic monstrousness to young people. And I think that's really, really important.
I have to ask you, David, since you have studied such topics for years, what gives you hope in humanity? What makes you keep going?
I distinguish between optimism and hope. I'm not at all optimistic, but I am hopeful in that we have to work to do the best we can to change things. And I think this is increasingly urgent because the social changes that are going to come with climate change will create a perfect storm for the most horrible, horrible forms of violence. And those will undoubtedly, the wheels of slaughter will be greased with dehumanization, as they always are.
And so what the hope is where?
The hope is, well, first of all, maybe I'm wrong. But to me, hope is trying. Look, if you have no hope, you don't try. I write, look, it sounds really corny, and I know it's foolish. Can I tell you a joke?
Yeah,
Just a short joke.
Please.
It's at the end of the introduction to this book on inhumanity, which is the best starter book for my work. And it's my favorite Jewish joke. And it's one of those Jewish jokes that you don't laugh at, right? It's not funny. It's poignant. So there's a village someplace in Russia, and there's the guy who, you know, he's cognitively disabled. There's no job he can do, but the rabbi makes sure that everyone's employed. So let's call him Shlomo. Shlomo is given the task of dragging a chair to the edge of the village and sitting on it and looking into the horizon and waiting for the Messiah to come. So he does that. Every day he schleps the chair out. One day a stranger comes up, sees him, says, "What are you doing?" He says, "It's my job." He says, "I'm waiting for the Messiah. The hours are long, the pay is bad, but it's steady work." That's how I understand what I'm doing. You know, we've got to try our best, even if it seems like a quixotic task.
That's great. And so are you and/or Subrena working on a new project in this vein?
Well, that's an interesting story. We want to co-author a book on race. And we've been trying to get this accepted by a publisher for 2 years. Initially, there was great interest. Maybe 10 trade publishers contacted our agent. This was during COVID, so there were interviews on Zoom. The editors were all excited. They went back to their people, and one by one, they pulled out. Publishers are scared. They're scared of blowback. They're scared that this is too controversial. They're scared that our work will be misappropriated by bad actors and so on, even though the way we do this, I think there's no possibility of that. We take care. So, I mean, just recently, we had an editor, a Nigerian-American editor, who was really behind this book. She said it transformed her vision of human society. She went to bat for us, but the higher-ups, no, we can't publish it. So our agent keeps trying, but I fear that this isn't going to happen. And I find this extremely sad because I think this is a very, very urgent matter just for people to think about, you know. We're not trying to get people to accept our view. What we're trying to do is get them to consider it.
That's infuriating.
Oh, I want to cry talking about it. We've put so much work into this and we think it's so important, but...
Do you think that's an issue in the United States? Is it an issue everywhere?
Oxford University Press turned us down.
And is this topic of race specific to the United States?
No, it's an international... So, we have to understand what race is. That's really important. So in our view, first of all, when we're talking about race, it has to cover all the cases. It has to cover how, say, Tommy Curry is thought of, as well as my Jewish grandmother, who had pale skin, blue eyes, blonde hair, but if the family hadn't left Romania early in the 20th century, she probably would have ended up in an oven in Poland. Right? Race has to cover all that and more. So we have to look for the common factors. And fortunately, there's a very rich historical literature that allows us to do this. So I think race has three components. It's the idea that there are a few fundamentally, essentially different kinds of people, that the status of belonging to one of these kinds of people is transmitted biologically, normally by descent, but there are some interesting variations on that. And third, most controversially, and this really gets people's backs up, it's hierarchical. Race is designed to oppress. So those who are racialized by the dominant group are seen as inferior, intrinsically inferior human beings. Their lives don't matter or don't matter as much. So there are local variations on this theme all over the world. The United States has one version. Eastern Europe has another version. Rwanda has another version.
And you've said racism created race.
Absolutely. And more radically, I think racism is built into the very notion of race.
And in this, it's similar to dehumanization, maybe, that it's always these powerful...
Yes.
Are trying...
Dehumanization and follows the racial template. It just takes it a little bit further. Yeah.
Is maybe the problem at the core hierarchy, inequality of all this?
Well, that's one aspect. It's a complex problem.
Yeah.
That's certainly a very important component of it because we are, I think, naturally inclined as highly social primates to see human, right? It takes some work to get people to subvert that tendency.
Have people been receptive in general to your efforts or your attempts to eradicate?
Yeah, I think so. More about dehumanization than about race.
Right.
Yeah. But surprisingly many about race, particularly, by the way, in the United States, people of color who have immigrated to the United States. That was Subrena's. She came from Jamaica. Race wasn't a thing there. Class was. And she comes to the United States and suddenly she's black. And she felt herself getting twisted out of shape. It was very disorienting and hurtful to be treated not just as a human being, but as a member of a certain kind of group that she just didn't particularly identify with, right?
Yeah. Thank you, David. That was a very interesting talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.